I want to say it's not just psychological or perceptual vulnerabilities we're talking about here. There's also identity level vulnerabilities. And that's where this gets really insane. I mean, in the film, The Social Dilemma, we talk about how if I'm, a foreign adversary of the United States, and I want people to not think this is not some partisan just Russia thing or China thing. There's lots of countries that are now doing this. I can go into a conspiracy theory group like a QAnon, like a Pizzagate or whatever, and I can actually get the user IDs of people that are of that mindset. Then I can pump them into a Facebook lookalike model and say, give me users who have the same kind of profile like that. So Facebook is giving me, it's not just that Facebook was doing gain of function research on memetics or on groups or extremism. It's that they're actually offering gain of function. It's gain of function as a service. They're offering that to other parties to actually get more and more clever at being able to find and navigate. And then further there, split test which messages would work for those audiences. And one of the things that we know, and again, I want to be really careful because we can steel man and there's a pre-trans fallacy on what a conspiracy is, and there's this sort of, using it to deride people who think versus the actual genuine, real conspiracies that are true. But I think this is really important because one of the other things we know about conspiracy thinking is the best predictor of whether you'll believe in another conspiracy is whether you already believe in one, because it starts to warp the basis of your perception, the kind of trust that you have. Like if it was true that the entire government was lying about COVID and it actually did come from the US, which who knows where it came from, and that's a topic of conversation. But if it were intentional in that way, that would certainly warp the perceptions downstream of everything else. Because if that were true, then all these other things were true. Now we're getting into, I don't want to go too deep into, one of these specific ones or not, because I want to stay on the kind of identity hacking, but I wanted to make sure we were clear that the level of psychological and evolutionary hacking is mimetic, it's perceptual, it is social validation based, it is social relationship based, it's also identity based. In fact, in Facebook's own documents in 2009 or 10 that it was, they had a Facebook marketing team in Australia that said, we literally know when a child, when a user has low self-esteem. They were talking about teenagers. They literally can predict based on usage patterns when you are low self-esteem. And that's an identity level manipulation, which is very much like cults. Cults actually catch people in moments of vulnerability. What we know from cult recruiting is that they're actually in between huge moments of transition. Something in their life, a meaning-making structure has collapsed, whether it's a relationship or a job or a deceased loved one or divorce. And they're in that moment of low self-esteem and kind of low meaning. And that's exactly what makes them more vulnerable. And what we've enabled, and Sam Harris and I talked about this on his podcast, is a kind of cult factory where there is a mass finding of people in vulnerable states and then being able to personally target to a whole new degree, again, with this sort of gain of function metaphor, what we could do to steer them. And the idea that this is the default infrastructure that runs our digital economy, that this would allow, that we would allow for and even make money from the gain of functionization of everything, is incredibly dangerous. And I just want to drive people there because I want people to see just how deeply the reform needs to be.
Yeah, marvelous. So I do want to briefly touch on this issue of conspiracy predicting whether or not, the belief in a single conspiracy results in a change in your likelihood of, or at least it predicts that you will believe in a second one. That actually this is about a heuristic being built, right? To the extent that something persuades you that collusion has taken place in a given circumstance, it naturally adjusts your sense of how common collusion is. And corrosively, it adjusts your sense of how to weight evidence. Because if there's one thing that's common to all conspiracies, it is that they portray some other possibility as more likely. They inherently frame some alternative. So basically what it does is it forces you to sideline your obligation to Occam's razor. And there are cases where a little bit of sidelining of Occam's razor is absolutely necessary to make progress, but it's also the kind of thing that if you give up on it, you just become a sucker, right?
That's right.
So it's very hard to navigate that space. And basically by pumping noise in, we are breaking people's relationship to reality and evidence very directly. And the consequence is all but inevitable, I would say. Right? Of course, people will just become so distrustful that they will effectively become full-time superstitious.
That's right. And that's kind of where we are, is what it feels like, right? I mean, and the challenge, as you said, is there are ways of navigating the beyond Occam's razor explanation for something. And you're doing that a lot here on your program. And I think that's, really fantastic, but people need the tools to do that carefully, because that process can externalize a kind of naive distrust, or a kind of naive epistemic process that starts to, as you said, kind of get further and further superstitious. And if you don't have the tools, and I think much like I always use a developmental paradigm when I think about these things, it's certain ages we speak in some ways, it's other ages we speak in other ways. We tell you about Santa Claus, this is our friend Daniel Barquet's point, that he said life is a lifelong process of killing Santa Claus. Like you're sort of taught one Santa Claus metaphorical story, the porcupine thing, the simplistic story that suits you for a period. It's a growth, it's a jacket you can wear for that period, but then you outgrow it and there's a different developmental paradigm. So maybe if we're going to engage in non-Occam's razor narratives and really do investigations, we have to be aware of developmentally which minds we're speaking to. Am I talking to someone who's literally kind of a basement conspiracy theorist with like a bunch of guns in their closet and they're ready to go take arms to something? Consequentially, I have to be more worried about the way that my communication might impact that person than if I'm talking to, someone who's really thoughtfully engaging with alternative narratives and epistemology and actually has a whole process that they've developed to navigate that. And I think that's one of the things that we lose, especially in a social media landscape, when you're broadcasting to 10 million people at once. We don't have a developmentally sensitive communication, meaning our communication is going to so many people that we assume, and this is probably the wise critique of engaging in any kind of alternate narrative thinking, is, hey, you, Eric, and you, Brett, are not sufficiently engaging with how people might hear you consequentially. But then you're saying, yeah, but you don't see that we're ignoring really important truths that if we don't get to talk about, we're going to get trapped by political correctness, or we're going to get trapped by these other things. And this is where I think it gets very, very interesting.
Yeah. And actually, this is another uncomfortable topic, which is that I know I am capable of calculating that some of the places where I question the official narrative, it is essentially certain that people are going to get hurt as a result of my revealing that these things are questionable. So, for example, if we talk about what we don't know about vaccine safety with respect to the novel COVID vaccines, it is essentially inevitable, given the size of the audience, that a certain number of people will change their view on whether to get the vaccine. Some of them will get COVID. Some of them may die. Other people may catch COVID from them who will die. That's a terrible responsibility. I don't want it. No rational person could want it. But what I believe is that our sense-making around these things is so broken that we are already killing people as a result of our obligation to sign up for these official narratives that aren't true. And so I guess, it's hard to know what the right analogy is, but the mechanism that you have been exploring through which attention is captured and sense-making is deranged, that mechanism is like somebody has been working on a computer or some sort of robotic device that you can put in the driver's seat of your car and it can pilot you, right? Now, I don't doubt that you can make a self-driving car. We all know that's coming sooner or later. But if you tell me that you've built this in your garage and you're going to put it in the driver's seat of the car and we're going to go somewhere, we're going to crash. This is a prototype, right? And the nature of prototypes is that you're going to discover all of the hazards you didn't know about along the way. And you really want to discover that on a closed track. You don't want to discover that with civilization in tow, right? And that's where we are, is we are running the biggest experiment that has ever been run in real time with all of us on board. There's not some population living somewhere who isn't downstream of the effects of this, even if you're offline, right? We're all in.
Totally. It's, I think you and others have said it's the largest unregulated psychology experiment we've ever run with no IRB board. If you want to use the Zuckerberg Institute of Virology metaphor and you have what is it called? The level 5 sort of biolabs or something? Yeah, right. Level 4. So if you have kind of the level 4, societal engineering lab, but you're literally not even doing it in the big white suits and in the kind of enclosed spaces, you're just doing it on civilization constantly. You're in this sort of 24/7, and we're actually still there, right? It's not as if right now there are not 3 billion people who just jacked into Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc., who are now in the live sort of, mimetic tweaking of where these things are going. And so now the virus is sort of out of control. We're doing live tweaking to try to steer it. And I think at this point, by the way, I want to say I often am perceived as sort of a critic of the system or making people evil. I don't believe any of these people are evil. I think they have not seen the consequences of the process that they were in, the race to the bottom of the brainstem evolutionary landscape that they were competing within. But the problem is now they don't have, even the tools, the levers to actually do the gain of function or the sort of the tweaking back towards some kind of stabilizing force. And that's, I think, the predicament that we're really in. And frankly, this is the open inquiry I'm in, is I think we obviously need tweaking of the technology and to fix it at that level, because that's the thing that we're continually jacked into. But I also think we need, almost like, once the pandemic of COVID is out there, we do need some kind of protection mechanism to isolate the virus. I think we need a cultural antibody. We need a cultural awareness. We need a cultural, I don't want to say vaccine because that itself is polarizing, but we need some kind of common understanding. And the thing that I don't want to speak too highly of the film's impact for the social dilemma, but I think one thing it does do, since about 100 million people have seen it, is it creates a new shared common ground about at least one very primary explanation about how we lost common ground to this degree. So to have shared common ground about where and how we've lost common ground is at least a place to stand from, so that we can then say, how do we want to proceed back into more common ground? And I think that's kind of an open inquiry that I'm in, is what does that look like?
All right, two things. One, we are in, if we go back to the earlier part of our conversation about shared fate and what it allows you to assume is true. The irony here is that we have shared fate, right? This is a tiny planet. Our industrial processes are at a scale now that we are our own biggest hazard. And so our fate is tied. And to the extent that our sense-making is deranged because in the moment one group can get financially ahead of another by doing things that derange us, in the long run, we may all perish together as a result of the process, having not realized, having not had it built into us that our fate is shared and we should treat it carefully the way you would treat your spouse, for example. But I also think there's a way in which even the dire picture that you just painted doesn't fully describe the hazard, because let's say that there was only Google, right? If only Google was involved in deranging us, then Google stands a chance of figuring out the hazard and correcting things, right? Backing us away from the precipice. But the problem is, let's say that Google figured out that they were a hazard and realized they repented, right? And they, invested a huge amount in figuring out how to underange us. But Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all the other forces weren't on board with the program, right? It's a little like imagining we're hurtling through an asteroid field, right? And you've got 6 people in 6 different control rooms trying to adjust the cameras that allow us to see where the asteroids are. And so as one person adjusts a dial that makes the image better, somebody else may adjust a dial to put it back the way it was because they were trying some other correction, right? All of these disconnected things are basically an amplifier for noise, right? At best. At best. So now the question really, let's say that something like that is going on. The question really is, what conceivable solutions exist here?